Before time had a name, before maps were drawn and borders were imagined, the land stretched endlessly beneath the sky. Mountains rose like the bones of the earth, rivers cut ancient paths through stone and soil, and forests moved gently in the wind like breathing giants. In the quiet of this early world, long before cities, roads, or the written word, the first peoples began to walk the land that would one day be called America. They did not measure time in hours or days. Time was the movement of the sun across the sky, the call of migrating birds, the slow freeze of winter waters, and the thaw of spring soils. Time was the rhythm of survival, the fire crackling in the night, the crunch of footsteps on frosted grass, the soft murmur of water over river stones. These early people travelled in small bands, guided not by compasses, but by stars, wind, and memory. Their footprints crossed open plains, ancient forests, frozen tundra, and river valleys rich with life. They carried little: flint tools, fire-making stones, animal skins, and stories passed from one breath to another. Their homes were not fixed places, but wherever the earth welcomed them. A circle of stones for a fire, a frame of branches draped in hides, a woven mat of reeds laid gently on the ground. These were enough. Each day began in silence. Long before dawn lit the sky, the first glow of fire embers stirred beneath ash. The air was cold and still, the world holding its breath just before sunrise. A thin mist drifted above river surfaces, while frost lay like glass upon grass and branches. The people moved slowly in this early hour. There was no rush. Life followed quiet patterns. Women gathered dried grasses and herbs left to cure near the fire the night before. These would become tea, bedding, cordage, or medicine. Men inspected stone blades and spear points, running fingers gently along their edges, testing for sharpness. Children helped by fetching water from streams in carved wooden bowls or carrying bundles of firewood on their backs, small footprints beside larger ones in the dirt. Hunting was not a sport, but a quiet prayer to survival. Hunters walked with the wind in their faces, so their scent would not travel to the animals ahead. They studied broken twigs, soft depressions in mud, disturbed snow, signs that deer or bison had passed. Their spears were made with hardened wooden shafts, tipped with carefully chipped stone. Some used atlatls, spear throwers that extended the arm, increasing speed and distance. Each movement was deliberate, each breath quiet. They knew that one mistake could send food fleeing beyond reach. Back in camp, fires burned low, their smoke trailing upward into the cold air. Stones placed in the heart of the flame absorbed heat, glowing faintly. When wrapped in hides or placed beneath layers of grass and fur, these stones became warmth through the night, a secret held deep within the earth. Around the fire, people prepared food gathered from forest and river. Dried meat sliced thin from previous hunts, berries preserved in woven baskets, roots dug from soft soil before winter hardened it. Some places yielded fish, caught with bone hooks or woven traps set between stones in shallow river water. The first people knew no walls, no clocks, no written records, yet their lives were rich with meaning. They honoured the land not with monuments, but with careful steps and open hands. They knew the language of wind in the grass, the silent passing of clouds, the tracks left by animals in fresh snow. Their stories were not written on paper. They were spoken softly at night, carried in memory, echoing long after the fire dimmed. As the sun rose higher, shadows retreated slowly behind stones and trees. The world awakened in gentle colours. Pale gold across the tall grasses, deep blue on still water, soft grey over distant mountains. And in this quiet awakening, the people continued with the tasks that shaped their days. Tanning hides, shaping stones, drying meat, weaving fibres into rope and nets, carving wood for tools and bowls. Every movement was part of a rhythm older than memory. The turning of seasons, the flow of rivers, the smoke rising into the morning sky. Life was not hurried, because nothing in nature was hurried. The first people simply listened, watched, and followed. Evening would come again. Fires would flicker to life. Stars would appear, one after another, filling the sky like scattered embers from a celestial flame. And beneath them, the people would sleep, wrapped in fur, warmed by stones, surrounded by the whispers of the night world. And so life continued before time had a name. Morning did not arrive with sudden brightness, but with a patient unfolding of light. The first pale glow touched the horizon like a whisper, brushing over sleeping grasslands, river stones, and the quiet shapes of early encampments. A thin mist clung low to the earth, drifting slowly across open prairies and forest floors. The air was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth, wood smoke, and slow-moving water. Within small circles of shelters, some woven from branches and grass, others made from animal hides, stretched carefully over wooden poles. Life stirred gently. There were no shouted commands, no urgency to break the stillness. Life moved with the rhythm of the earth, and so the people rose only when the embers of the night's fire glowed softly, ready to be awakened into flame again. Stones, placed carefully within the heart of last night's fire, still held warmth. These stones were lifted with sticks and wrapped in hide or fur, then placed beneath bedding to ease tired muscles and guard against the night's cold. The fire ring itself, built from stones gathered from riverbanks, held stories of countless nights, ash layered over ash, memories layered over time. Water was drawn from the river in carved wooden bowls or animal skin bags. The river moved slowly, its surface smooth, except for occasional ripples where fish rose to the surface or where the current touched a stone. Near the water, the first footprints of morning were left on dew-covered ground, soft impressions from bare feet hardened by many seasons of walking. The land was their map, their teacher, and their memory. Food was prepared without haste. Thin slices of dried meat, preserved with smoke and salt from plants, were warmed on flat stones near the fire. Berries, collected carefully during warmer seasons, rested in tightly woven baskets. Roots, dug from rich soil when the earth was still soft, lay soaking in warmed water. Children helped where they could, gathering wood, filling small containers with snow in winter, or carrying stones for the hearth. The hunters, already awake, walked silently beyond the light of the rising sun. They moved like shadows through trees and brush, following faint trails left by animals long before dawn. A bent blade of grass, a fresh hoofprint in soft earth, a broken stem of willow, all spoke with quiet voices to those who knew how to listen. Their weapons were crafted with patience, stone points shaped through long hours of chipping, sanding and smoothing, shafts made from straight young saplings, scraped and cured by fire and sunlight. Far from camp, The land stretched open and vast. Tall grasses swayed with the morning wind. Forests whispered as branches touched one another. Rivers wound between stones smoothed by centuries of flow. High above, birds traced slow arcs across the sky, searching for thermal currents to lift their wings. The world was not empty. It was alive, breathing, watching. Back in camp, work continued in gentle rhythm. Animal hides, scraped clean of flesh and sinew, were stretched between wooden frames to dry. Stone tools were shaped by steady hands, flakes falling softly onto the ground. Bones were carved into needles, fish hooks, and points. Fibers from plants were twisted into cord, thread, and net. The people worked not to conquer the land but to live alongside it. As the sun climbed higher, warmth spread across the earth. Shadows shortened. Birds called from treetops. The ice on river edges began to soften, leaving a thin, trembling surface that reflected the sky. Throughout the day, the people moved with purpose, but without haste. They could feel the turning of the world, the slow passing of seasons, the quiet approach of winter or the promise of spring, and they shaped their lives to these patterns. They knew that nothing in nature moved without reason. The migration of animals, the freezing of lakes, the blooming of plants, all were signs, all were guidance. Even the stars at night told stories of direction, of time, of ancestral paths across the land. When evening began to fall, the world changed again. Sunlight softened, becoming gold, then amber, then a quiet, deep blue. The first stars appeared faint and distant above the horizon. Fires were kindled back to flame from resting embers. Shadows stretched long, then disappeared as darkness settled over the land. Food was shared, water heated, fur bedding laid out in circles around the fire. There were no walls, no written language, yet memory flowed like a river from one generation to the next. It lived in gestures, in rituals, in the way hands shaped tools, and in the way feet followed the trails of ancestors. As night deepened, the land grew silent again. Only the crackle of fire, the slow breath of sleepers, and the distant howl of a lone wolf broke the stillness. Above, stars burned like ancient embers in a sky vast and endless, and so the people slept, warmed by stone, sheltered by hide, protected by the ancient rhythm of earth and fire. Before time had a name, this was life. The land moved gently beneath the rising sun, its breath a slow vapor that drifted across open plains and river valleys. Mountains stood at the farthest edge of sight, their peaks softened by morning mist. Forests, vast and ancient, swayed in silence as the wind threaded through towering pines and leaf-bare oaks. In this land, untouched by roads or the sound of iron, life unfolded with patience, the way water carves stone over centuries. The people rose with the earth, never before or after it. Light crept softly through the seams of animal hide shelters, illuminating the quiet order within them. Sleeping robes made of fur, baskets of dried berries, tools placed in careful patterns near the hearth. The embers in the fire still held life from the night before, breathing beneath grey ash like distant stars waiting for darkness. With a few dry twigs and a whispered stir of air, flames awoke once more, glowing gentle gold across the ground. The morning fire was more than heat. It was a centre, a place where life gathered. Around it, stones warmed slowly, to be used later beneath bedding or in cooking. Thin curls of smoke lifted and mingled with the cold air, carrying the scent of wood and pine sap upward into the sky. Against this warmth, bowls carved from bone and wood were filled with water from the stream and placed near the coals to heat. Pieces of dried meat, berries preserved in woven reed baskets, and crushed nuts were added to simmer. No sound was hurried. Even the birds called softly from their perches among branches dusted in frost. Children walked to the riverbank with skins or woven vessels, their breath forming clouds before them. The river ran quietly beneath a thin layer of ice near its edge, whispering beneath the frozen surface. They dipped their hands into the cold water and filled their vessels with care, watching ripples spread outward like circles of time. In another part of the encampment, the older members of the group sat near the firelight, their hands moved with memory, smoothing leather, stitching furs, grinding pigments from stones. They spoke little, for words were not needed. Knowledge flowed through actions, the way a sewing bone pierced hide, the way sinew was drawn tight, the way a stone must be chipped at just the right angle to reveal its edge. These were lessons older than any story, passed from one steady hand to the next. Hunting parties walked beyond the trees, leaving only a faint trail of footprints in the soft earth. Their path followed the natural lines of the land, along river banks, through tall grasses, across the rises of hills where they could see further than the eye of a deer. The wind brushed against their faces, carrying with it the scent of sage, frost, soil, and distant herds. They stopped often, not to rest, but to listen. A broken blade of grass, the faint print of hooves in mud, the rustle of branches. These were the words of the land, and they understood them as clearly as their own breath. Farther from camp, the land opened wide. Herds of ancient bison, thick with winter fur, grazed in silence. Elk moved along the edges of forests, their steps soft upon snow-covered ground. High above, hawks circled in the pale morning light, their wings spread wide, gliding with the patience of the sky itself. Back at camp, life continued in quiet rhythm. Water boiled in clay pots, steam curling like soft feathers into the air. Strips of meat dried on racks near the fire, darkening under the slow lick of heat. Bones from previous hunts were cracked open for marrow, rich and sustaining. Flint was struck against stone to sharpen spear tips, tiny sparks disappearing almost as quickly as they appeared. As the sun rose higher, the earth changed colour. Frost melted from grass. The air grew softer, carrying the scents of pine, river, and wood smoke. Shadows shifted beneath the shelters and trees, stretching and shrinking as the day moved forward. No part of life was wasted or forgotten. The hide of a deer became warmth for night, the sinew became thread, the bones became tools and hooks. Even the hooves, softened by heat, were shaped into containers or carved into instruments that hummed softly when wind touched them. The people lived with the land, not against it. They took what was needed, offered thanks in ways beyond words, and left the rest to grow again. When the sun had reached its height, the hunters returned. Some carried game, others returned empty-handed but not defeated. The land gave only when it chose to give, and the people understood this. Meat was prepared quietly. Blood was mixed with snow to harden and preserve. Bones were laid aside for tools, and nothing was taken for granted. As daylight softened into gold and the first shadows of evening appeared, fires were fed again. Shelters glowed from within with warmth. Steam rose from cooking vessels. The world grew quieter, softer, as if preparing for sleep. The first stars blinked into the darkening sky, ancient and familiar. The wind stilled. The river, shimmering in moonlight, moved like liquid silver between dark banks. The people lay beneath fur and hide, warmed by stones, cradled by earth, surrounded by the soft breath of night. Sleep came slowly, not as escape, but as a continuation of the day. One long, unbroken rhythm, fire to ember, dawn to dusk, life to life. This was the way of the first people, before time had a name. Far from the sound of modern life, there was a world where dawn did not arrive with alarm clocks or engines, but with the slow exhale of mist rising from rivers and the awakening songs of birds hidden among tall grasses. In this world, the earliest native peoples began their days not by rushing toward tasks, but by feeling the earth beneath their feet, sensing the rhythm of the land long before it bore the footprints of cities or roads. Families lived near water, where rivers curled like silver threads through forests and meadows. These rivers were more than just sources of water. They were lifelines that carved stories into the land, teaching people when fish would move upstream, when the ice would break in spring, and when the reeds along the banks were ready to be woven into baskets. Before the concept of time was ever measured by hours or minutes, it was measured by the thawing of river ice, the blooming of wildflowers, the migrations of geese across the skies. In the heart of the wilderness, homes were built with patient hands, shaped from what the land willingly offered. In the east, where forests were thick and towering, the people built long houses from strips of bark and arched wooden poles. They stretched deer hides across openings to keep in warmth, and smoke from their small fires curled toward holes in the roof, carrying the faint scent of cedar into the morning sky. In the great plains farther west, beyond the forests, where grass danced endlessly beneath the wind, homes took different shapes. Teepees made of buffalo hides stood tall, their pointed tops piercing the sky like quiet watchmen. In the high desert lands, where the mesas rose like silent giants and the wind sculpted stone, people carved their homes into cliffs or built pueblos of clay and straw, their walls holding coolness in summer and warmth in winter. Before anything else, the people greeted the morning quietly. They stepped from their dwellings, feet touching earth still kissed by the cold of night. Smoke from hundreds of small fires drifted upward, blurring the line where sky met ground. Children tended to small chores, gathering twigs, checking on drying fish, brushing soft fur pelts that would later become blankets or clothing. Elders made their slow way to the fire pits, their memories containing countless winters and summers, remembering times when herds moved differently or rivers carved new paths. Food was gathered with patience, for the land did not give its gifts in haste. Along riverbanks, women harvested cattail roots and wild rice, their hands moving with practiced grace. In the forests, hunters left before the first light, following hoofprints in the mud, understanding the signs left in broken twigs and disturbed leaves. Bows creaked softly as they were drawn, and arrows flew through the silence of dawn. Nothing was taken wastefully. Bones became tools, hides became shelters, sinew became thread, and meat was smoked slowly over fires to last through winter moons. In the open prairies, hunters followed the breath of the bison herds, which darkened the horizon like storm clouds. The earth shook softly beneath thousands of hooves, and the hunters moved quietly around them. knowing the patterns of their grazing, their migrations, and their seasons of calving. After a successful hunt, the entire camp worked together, cutting, drying, preserving, thanking the animal for its gift of life. Nothing was simply discarded. Each piece had a purpose, a continuation in the great story of survival. As the sun stood overhead, casting long shadows of trees upon the earth, daily life slowed into rhythms of craft and care. Fires crackled softly beneath clay pots, where stews simmered with roots, greens, and dried meats. Smoke from these fires twisted lazily around carved stone bowls, woven baskets, and smooth river stones used for grinding grains. Children listened quietly to elders who carved patterns into bone tools or smoothed arrow shafts with stones worn smooth by years of work. Their voices were not loud, yet they carried across generations, teaching not only how to survive, but how to live with balance. Farther north, where winters were long and snow lay on the ground like a quiet blanket, people shaped shelters from packed snow and ice, warmed within by animal skins and small fires. They watched the sky for the dancing lights that rippled across the night, the aurora shifting like spirits in silence. In these lands, breath froze in the air, and silence had a deeper sound, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. No matter where they lived, forest, prairie, desert, mountain, the people saw themselves not as separate from the land, but as part of it. They did not own the rivers, or the wind, or the animals. They lived alongside them. They followed the cycles of the moon, the migrations of birds, the return of salmon. They knew that the land remembered everything, every step, every fire, every whisper of gratitude spoken into the night air. As shadows lengthened and daylight softened, smoke rose again from fires being rekindled for the evening meal. The scent of herbs, roasted meat, and fresh bread made from ground seeds drifted gently through the air. People sat near the fire in silence, listening to the crackle of wood and the call of night birds. Above them, the sky slowly deepened into shades of blue and violet. Stars pierced through the dark like memories of distant fires. Night arrived without haste. Families wrapped themselves in furs and blankets stretched tight with sinew. In longhouses, flames flickered low inside stone-lined hearths. In tippies, fires whispered quietly in the center, their glow casting soft light on sleeping faces. In cliff dwellings, the wind brushed against stone walls like a lullaby. The world fell into a deep quiet, broken only by the hoot of an owl, the distant howl of a wolf, or the shifting of snow sliding from tree branches. And so, beneath skies older than memory, the first peoples of the land slept, not with fear of the cold or hunger, but with the knowledge that the earth would breathe again with the morning light. Before iron, before metal bells rang through villages or wheels carved roads into the soil, life was shaped by hands, stone, bone, wood, and fire. In that early world where dawn rose slowly across rivers and forests, the tools of daily life were not made in workshops or marketplaces. They were born from the silent understanding between human hands and the land that nourished them. The first people woke in shelters built from earth and bark, stretched hides or stone. The morning light touched unfinished tools resting beside sleeping mats, stones half-shaped into axes, long shafts of ash or hickory wood waiting to become spears, and pieces of antler soaked in water to soften them for carving. These were not merely objects. They were extensions of survival, memory, and identity. At the edge of a stream, a person knelt beside a smooth river stone, turning it in their hand. They looked for the right angle, the faint glimmer that told them where the stone would break cleanly. Using a hard hammerstone, they struck it with careful force. The air cracked softly as flakes of stone, sharp as ice, thin as leaves, flew away. This was flint knapping, the ancient art of turning rock into blades, arrowheads, scrapers, and knives. Each flake removed was purposeful, not from strength, but from precision. The core stone became sharper with each strike, edges refined for skinning hides, cutting meat, carving wood, or preparing roots. Nearby, long bone tools dried in the sunlight, made from the leg bones of deer, elk, or bison. When split and polished with stone or sand, these bones became awls, narrow and strong, used to pierce holes in hides. They made fish hooks, shaped from delicate rib bones or wishbones, honed against sandstone until they curved like the talons of a bird. Larger bones were carved into needles, slender and smooth, used to stitch clothing, moccasins, and shelters with sinew taken from the backs of animals. Children carried baskets woven from willow and reeds to gather fine stones and sharpened flakes lost in the dust. Elders sat near the fire pits, smoothing wooden handles with sandstone blocks until the surface felt warm and soft beneath their palms. They spoke without words through their actions, teaching the rhythm of making. Strike, rotate, breathe, and listen to the stone. In shaded areas beneath tall pines, woodworkers shaped bows from flexible ash, yew, or hickory. The wood was soaked, heated over steam, then bent slowly into a crescent shape. It was left to rest for many days, bound with cords of rawhide. Later, sinew was laid along its back, glued with the resin from spruce trees or fish bladder adhesive. When dried, the bow bent but did not break, storing the strength of the hunter's arm like held breath. Arrows were made with the same patience. Shafts were cut from young shoots of willow or dogwood, straightened over steam and weighed in the hand. The ends were split to fit flint arrowheads, fixed with warm pine resin and wrapped tightly with deer sinew. Feathers from hawks, turkeys, or geese were trimmed and bound to the other end, guiding the arrow through wind and distance. Each arrow was personal, carved and marked by its maker, known by feel and balance even in darkness. In villages near clay-rich riverbanks, fingers pressed into damp earth to shape pottery. Clay was gathered, mixed with crushed shells or ground stone to prevent cracking, and shaped by hand into bowls, pots, and shallow dishes. Designs were etched with bone combs or sharpened sticks, spirals of water, branching tree limbs, or patterns of migrating birds. Once dried in the sun, the pots were fired in open pits. Flames licked their surfaces, turning soft clay into hardened vessels that held rainwater, stews, berries, grains, and memories. Beside the clay workers, others twisted plant fibres into strong cordage. Milkweed, dogbane, or nettle fibres were stripped, dried, and rolled against the thigh to form twine. These cords tied arrowheads, bound the frames of shelters, set traps, wove nets for catching fish, and stitched clothing lined with fur. From the hides of deer and elk came rawhide, cut into long strips, stretched and dried. When soaked again, it softened, ready to lash tools or reinforce shields. Farther beyond the hearths and workshops, where forest thinned into meadow, Great stones marked places where people shaped grinding tools. Large, flat rocks, some worn by generations, held remnants of ground maize, seeds, acorns and roots. Over these stones, mano pestles fit perfectly in the curve of a palm, sliding back and forth in a patient rhythm. The sound of stone against stone was like a heartbeat, steady, ancient, unchanging, and still deeper into the forest, hunters returned from the chase. Their spears were tipped with stone or bone, shafts carved from ironwood. Some carried atlatls, long spear throwers that extended the strength of their arm. With a flick of the wrist, the spear flew farther and faster, striking bison or deer before they could run. Handled with mastery, the weapon was powerful, crafted from carved wood, sinew, and stone counterweights. When hunts were successful, the tools of death transformed into tools of life. Skinning knives sliced hides cleanly from muscle. Scrapers removed fat and tissue. Bone beams stretched hides in wooden frames to dry under sunlight. Smoke curled from fires where meat hung, drying into strips that would last through winter snows. As dusk came, the tools were set down. The hammerstones, the needles, the bows, the pots, each placed carefully beside the fire or hung from wooden racks. The land fell quiet again, save for the wind brushing through trees and the white whisper of river waters moving beneath moonlight. These tools, simple, silent, enduring, were not merely used. They were a language, a way of speaking without words to the land, to the animals, to the seasons. A promise that life would go on, shaped by hands that knew the earth as a friend, not a possession. Across the ancient lands, when the sun sank lower in the sky and the breath of the earth turned cold, life shifted quietly into the long rhythm of winter. Frost clung to grasses, rivers glazed over with ice, and the wind carried no softness, only a sharpness that crept through branches and reeds. Yet even in this cold, the people endured, not through strength alone, but through patience, memory, and the quiet knowledge of how to keep warmth alive. In the vast forests of the east, where snow blanketed the ground in deep silence, longhouses stood like sleeping giants. These shelters were made long before winter arrived, their frames bent from young trees and covered in layered slabs of bark from elm or cedar. Before the first frost, families gathered extra bark and wove it between the frame walls, adding moss and dried grasses in the cracks to stop the wind from entering. Inside, the heart of the longhouse burned steadily, a central fire pit hollowed into earth, surrounded by stones that held heat long after the flames died. The smoke wound upward through small openings in the roof, leaving behind a faint scent of ash and cedar. At night, warmth was preserved with great care. Beds were made from woven mats of cattail or rushes, layered with soft furs from deer, bear, or elk. Families slept close together, bodies creating a shared circle of heat. Children were wrapped in rabbit skins, the soft fur turned inward to keep their small hands and feet warm. Elders rested closest to the fire, their breathing steady, their presence like banked embers, quiet but enduring. Food was stored for these winter months long before the first snow, in hidden pits beneath the ground, sealed with stone and clay. Dried corn, beans, squash, and seeds rested safely. Clay pots held dried meat and ground maize, while strings of peppers and herbs hung from the ceilings, slowly drying in the still air. Water was stored in vessels made from clay, lifted carefully each day so they would not crack from cold. Farther north, where winter stretched across the land like a white shroud and the sun barely climbed over the horizon, survival required a different skill. In the lands of deep snow and frozen lakes, people built shelters from the very substance that surrounded them, blocks of snow cut from hard-packed drifts. These snow lodges, curved into domes, were not cold inside but surprisingly warm. Snow, though frozen, trapped air within it, making it a shield against the wind. Animal skins were laid on the floor, and a small flame, fed with animal fat rather than wood, glowed softly, its smoke escaping through a tiny opening near the peak. Clothing here was not merely a covering, but a final barrier between life and frost. Layers of caribou or seal skin, worn with the fur facing inward and outward, trapped warm air near the skin. Boots were lined with grasses or soft fur. Mittens, stitched from hide and sinew, held warmth close to the fingers. Every seam was made carefully, for even a single gap allowed the cold to creep in. Far across the open plains, where the wind moved without resistance, the people built homes that could breathe with the storms. Teepees rose from circles of wooden poles, covered in thick buffalo hides, tanned with smoke and fat to resist snow and rain. In winter, an extra lining of hides was hung inside, creating a double wall with an air pocket between, a barrier against the cold. Buffalo robes were spread across the ground, fur side up, and more hides were layered above them, trapping the warmth rising from the central fire. Even when winds howled outside, the air inside remained calm, filled with the slow crackle of burning wood. Fire was never allowed to die completely. Before sleeping, stones were heated in the flames and then rolled to the teepee's edge, wrapped in hide or placed beneath bedding to radiate heat. The people understood that fire was not only warmth, it was life held in red embers. All through the night, someone rose softly to add wood, careful not to disturb the sleeping. In the desert lands of the southwest, winter brought not only cold, but a deep dryness that hardened the earth. Here, homes were made differently, built from sun-baked clay mixed with straw, forming thick adobe walls. These walls, warmed by daylight and cooled at night, held the memory of the sun within them. Pueblos stacked against cliff faces offered protection from wind and allowed families to share warmth between their close walls. Inside, small hearths flickered beneath roof beams of juniper or pine, their flames reflecting against the smooth earthen floors. In all these places, the making of winter clothing began months before the first snow. Hides were cleaned on wooden frames, scraped with stone tools until thin and soft. Sinew was dried and pulled into thread, strong and slightly elastic. Needles carved from bone pierced the hide, pulling seams tight. Some coats were decorated with beads or quills, but beauty was always balanced with purpose. The clothing had to breathe, shed snow, block wind, and last many winters. Food, too, was a form of warmth. In the plains and woodlands, meat from bison, deer, or elk was sliced thin and dried in the sun or over smoky fires. Mixed with berries and melted fat, it became pemmican, dense, long-lasting, full of energy. This food travelled with families during hunts, or was stored in rawhide pouches for deep winter when hunting became scarce. In forests, fish were smoked on wooden racks, their oils preserved in clay pots or carefully sealed in animal stomachs. Nuts were cracked, ground into meal, and stored in woven baskets lined with hide. Before sleep, caretakers of the home walked quietly around the fire. They pushed glowing embers together, shielding them with ash to hold their heat until morning. Water skins were placed near the fire to prevent freezing. Extra wood was stacked indoors. Outside, the stars gleamed cold and distant, yet inside, beneath layers of hide and woven mat, the people slept wrapped in the memory of heat. Winter was not only endured, it was understood. It was known that fire must be fed gently, clothing made with patience, food gathered from seasons long past. Survival was not a battle against the cold, but a conversation with it, where every action, tying a sinew strand, placing a fur blanket, stacking firewood, was a quiet promise to see spring again. Snow drifted gently from a pale moonlit sky, gathering in silvery layers across the quiet village. The fires within the teepees had softened to warm embers, casting faint pulses of amber light that flickered against the snow-covered ground. The night air was sharp and unmoving, carrying the cold scent of frozen pines and the distant groan of ice forming along the creek. Inside the lodges, warmth lingered like a fragile promise. Thick buffalo hides draped the walls, trapping the heat and muffling the sounds of the winter wind outside. Families slept closely in clusters, sharing body heat beneath fur blankets sewn with sinew thread. Breaths rose softly in clouds of mist before vanishing into the air, merging with the low glow of the embers. Elders remained awake, tending the fires with deliberate, careful movements. They fed the coals with slender pieces of dried wood gathered before the first snow arrived, ensuring the flames never fully died. By their side lay winter tools, stone scrapers dulled from days of use, antler-handled knives, and awls carved from animal bone. Strips of cured hide, sinew, and feathers rested in neat bundles, ready to be formed into clothing, bowstrings, and snow-ready moccasins. Near the center of the village, hunters prepared in silence for the coming dawn. Weapons rested beside their sleeping places, ashwood bows newly restrung, spears tipped with sharpened bone, and hatchets designed for splitting frozen wood. Snowshoes made of willow and rawhide leaned against tippy poles, drying from the previous day's travel. Each item had been tested, repaired, and reinforced. Winter allowed no weakness. The night deepened. Frost crept along the edges of the teepee coverings, turning seams into delicate white lines. Beyond the lodges, a thin plume of smoke curled from each smoke hole, drifting slowly upward before dissolving into the silver of the sky. The forest, at the edge of the valley, stood silent and still, branches heavy with ice, and the faint tracks of deer and elk marked the snow like quiet stories written in white. Further out, a lone night watcher stood on a rise overlooking the sleeping camp. Wrapped in thick fur, the watcher remained motionless except for the slow rhythm of breath. The village below shimmered with dim firelight beneath the veil of snow, and nothing stirred but the clouds of breath that rose from the teepees. Mothers gently adjusted blankets over the youngest, ensuring no cold crept in along the edges. Fur-lined moccasins, drying by the embers, awaited the morning's first steps into the snow. Tools for trapping and hide tanning rested by the wall, reminders that survival was not only in hunting and fire, but in preparation, craft, and endurance. The night continued its slow descent into silence. No voices disturbed the air, Only the crackle of an ember, the soft rustle of a blanket, and the distant whisper of wind shifting through frozen branches. The village breathed as one, held together by warmth, craftsmanship, and the quiet labor of hands that understood the rhythm of winter. The night stretched on in stillness, and the snow continued to fall like grains of cold, drifting sand from a sky without sound. By this hour, the village seemed a world preserved beneath frost and darkness, its fires reduced to pulsing red beneath layers of ash, its people wrapped in sleep and silence. The land itself held its breath, no cry of bird, no movement of beasts, only the deep pulse of winter lying heavy on earth and bone. Inside each teepee, warmth existed as a fragile seam between life and frost. The framework of long poles, lashed tightly at their apex, creaked now and then as the cold contracted the wood. Over these poles, stitched hides of buffalo and elk breathed with the wind, flexing gently, their paws sealed with animal fat to keep out snow and moisture. Frost edged along the inside seams, making pale constellations of ice when the embers glowed. Families slept in layers, bodies drawn close on bedding made of willow mats and stacked furs. Beneath them, evergreen branches laid in thick bundles insulated their bodies from the frozen earth. Above them, pelts from coyote, wolf, and deer formed blankets against the cold. The air inside was filled with the faint aroma of smoke and cured hides, a scent that spoke of survival, of ancient winters endured the same way, year after year. Near the fire ring in each shelter, small tools and winter crafts lay neatly arranged, bone needles beside sinew threads, flakes of chert and obsidian waiting to be shaped into fresh arrowheads, bundles of dried tendons, bark fibers, and strips of rawhide soaking in clay pots to soften for weaving or binding. Dry gourds held pigment collected from river stones, used to seal and decorate tools when daylight returned. Every object had a purpose in the ongoing quiet war against the cold. Beyond the teepees, the world was a landscape of pale silver and deep shadow. The moon, half veiled by drifting clouds, cast a ghostly glow across the open plain. Snow blanketed every lodge, forming gentle slopes against their bases. The paths trodden hours earlier had already faded, buried beneath fresh layers of powder. Smoke rose from each smoke hole in thin columns before blending into the frozen night sky. The trees at the forest's edge stood tall and unmoving, their branches sagging beneath white burdens. Icicles clung to their limbs like glass teeth, and when the wind shifted, they chimed faintly against one another. Beneath those trees, stores of food were hung high, carved wooden racks holding dried venison, smoked fish, and braided strings of maize and squash. These caches stood like silent guardians against hunger, untouched for now, waiting for harsher days when snow locked the rivers and game vanished deeper into the hills. Far from the warming fires, a lone figure traced the ridge above the village, the night watcher. Fur clung tightly to their shoulders, breath unfurling in slow clouds. In one hand rested a spear tipped with sharpened flint, in the other a torch whose flame held weakly against the cold. From this height, the village seemed like a cluster of glowing stars fallen upon earth, each ember a small sun fighting against night. Inside the dwellings, elderly hands moved quietly, feeding embers, reshaping the fire rings just enough to keep warmth alive. In their minds, memories stirred, Winters harsher than this, nights when the wind tore through the valley like a spirit of ice, mornings when tents stood buried to their smoke holes. Their careful hands, deliberate and unhurried, passed wisdom into the sleeping hours, ensuring that flames never died and cold never claimed another life. Children, curled beneath hides, breathed in soft rhythm. Some clutched small carvings of animals or feathers braided into cords, tokens of comfort, stories carved in wood. Their dreams wandered across plains of summer grass, where bison thundered across the earth and rivers ran free of ice. Outside those dreams, winter stood guard, its silence deep and absolute. Near the edge of camp, the long racks for drying hides rose like pale skeletons against the sky. Some hides still hung there stiff as stone, their edges rimmed with frost. Others had been taken in for softening near the hearths, rubbed with animal brains and smoke cured to become coats, tent coverings, or winter moccasins. Tools for scraping, flat stones, rib bones, sharpened antlers, rested where they had been left hours earlier, their surfaces dusted by snow seeping in through seams. As night moved toward its deepest hour, the sky slowly cleared. Stars emerged like ancient fires, cold and unknowable, yet familiar to every hunter who studied them before dawn. The constellation of the hunter, the winter bear, and the river of spirits shimmered above, marking passage through the longest season of the year. These lights had guided migrations, predicted storms, and told stories older than memory. The cold intensified. Frost formed oval patterns on leather coverings. Breath froze on beards and eyelashes, and silence grew so deep it seemed to press against the ears. Yet the village remained calm, a living circle of warmth and endurance within a world carved from ice and shadow. There was no fear here, only preparation, routine, and the trust built across generations of surviving nights just like this. And so, beneath the hush of falling snow and the watchful light of distant stars, the village slept on, guarded by fire, by fur, by craft, and by the quiet strength of those who knew winter not as an enemy, but as an ancient companion. The night lingered in its deepest silence, and the snow's steady descent softened into a fine, glimmering dust that settled upon the earth like powdered stars. The village lay cocooned beneath its pale blanket, each teepee rounded by the weight of frost, each smoke plume rising in thin ghostly strands into the vast, unmoving darkness. The fires within burned low, more ember than flame, pulsing dimly like hearts beating beneath layers of hide and fur. The cold had reached its sharpest point. That hour when warmth wanes and the world seems suspended between darkness and the thought of dawn. The wind no longer howled. Instead, it crept in shallow breaths across the plains, stirring faint whispers through snow-laden grass. Every surface glittered with ice, teepee poles, tanned hides, braided ropes, even the outer rings of old footprints buried beneath new snow. Inside the shelters, the warmth was faint but enduring. Coals glowed in earthen fire pits, their dim light illuminating the interior with soft amber hues. The walls of stretched buffalo hide held the heat tightly, layered with sewn furs and insulated by packed snow around the base. Above, smoke drifted through the narrow opening, carrying with it the scent of pine resin, sage, and charred wood. Frost clung to the edges where warm air met cold hide, forming crystalline lace against the curved walls, Mothers rested with infants nestled against their chests, both wrapped in thick robes lined with rabbit or fox fur. The slow rise and fall of their breathing matched the rhythm of the fire's glow. Older children, bundled in layered hides, slept beside siblings or cousins on bedding woven from reeds and covered in elk pelts. Even in rest, they clung to small objects, carved wooden animals, dream catchers made from sinew and willow, or beads sewn into tiny pouches tied at their wrists. Near the centre of each lodge, tools for the coming day waited in quiet readiness. Flint scrapers wrapped in hide, bone awls sharpened for stitching winter moccasins, stone knives resting atop wooden boards still dusted with the remnants of tanning work. Sinew threads hung from wooden pegs, stretched and drying after being softened in warm water infused with ash. Bundles of dried cattail fluff sat ready for insulating footwear or cradles, a small protection against frozen ground. Outside, the world remained motionless. The forest bordering the village stood like a dark wall of silence, its trees burdened with frost. Beneath their branches, animal trails wound through the snow, fresh deer tracks leading toward the riverbank, the faint imprint of a fox trotting along a burrowed path, the deep, deliberate footprints of elk moving toward the sheltered canyon. Closer to the village, traps lay buried beneath snow, hidden near brush and stream beds, their wooden frames dusted in white. The night watcher still stood on the rocky outcrop overlooking the village, fur-lined cloak pulled close, watching the horizon. At intervals, the watcher moved to stir the ground snow to keep waking warmth in their limbs, then returned to stillness. At their feet, the earth was hard and cold, twined with frozen roots and scattered stones. The spear resting in their hand caught the moonlight, its flint head pale and sharp against the dark. Beyond the encampment, the river was wrapped in ice, yet still whispered beneath its frozen shell. Weak moonlight glinted along the water's surface, where the ice cracked in long, branching veins. Along its banks, the icy reeds bent under the weight of frost, their brittle forms whispering against one another when the breeze passed. From this place, water had been gathered hours before, carried in buffalo hide containers to be warmed over the fires for broth. Within a smaller shelter, used for storage, piles of dried meat, smoked fish, and preserved berries waited in woven baskets and rawhide bags. Rows of maize and beans hung from the rafters, protected from moisture and scavengers. Sinew-bound racks of snowshoes lay beside bundles of dried willow branches, ready to be reshaped for repairs with steam from heated stones. Clay pots, filled earlier with tallow melted from fat, cooled slowly, their surfaces now solid and matte in the cold air. Hours passed quietly, and the night edged toward its final stretch before dawn. The embers of each fire began to swell again as elders gently stirred them, adding small twigs and chips of pine that had been dried near the hearth. Thin flames flickered to life, pushing back the cold that crept across the floors. Wisps of new smoke curled upward, glowing faintly in the firelight before fleeing into the night through smoke holes. The winter sky began to shift. Stars faded near the horizon as the first shy gleam of pale blue touched the edge of the world. It was not yet dawn, but something quieter, the breath before daylight, the soft turning of night toward morning. In this hour, the cold pressed hardest, urging fires to be fed, blankets pulled closer, and bodies to inch nearer to warmth. Yet no fear stirred within the camp, only constancy, only the practiced rhythm of those who had weathered years of winters, winds, and passing seasons. Within the heart of each lodge, past and present lived together. In the tools of survival, the layered hides, the breath of sleepers, the muted glow of embers that refused to die. And so, under the quiet weight of stars and snow, the village endured, awaiting the first light that would reveal tracks, awaken fires, and send hunters and gatherers into the world once more. Not in triumph over winter, but in harmony with it. Dawn approached slowly, not as a sudden brightness, but as a gentle loosening of darkness. The night's deepest cold held firm for a while longer, clinging to hide coverings, frozen earth, and breath suspended in the air. The stars faded one by one, softening in the sky until only the distant morning star remained, watching silently over the still sleeping village. The snow-covered teepees, rounded under layers of frost, began to shift from moonlit silver to muted grey as the horizon hinted at light. Thin smoke drifted steadily from each smoke flap, curling into the pale air, carrying with it the scent of pine wood, smouldering coals, and faint traces of herbs placed into the fire hours before. The silence of the night gave way to a softer stillness, a waiting, not empty, but filled with quiet breath and memory. Within each shelter, the embers glowed brighter as elders stirred the fire rings back to life. They moved with careful hands, adding thin slivers of wood first, allowing flames to awaken without startling the warmth into smoke. As the heat grew, frost on the inner walls began to melt into dark droplets that traced patterns along the sewn hide seams. The faint crackling of fire interwove with the soft rustle of fur blankets being pulled closer against the morning chill. The sleepers remained curled around warmth, families nestled side by side, children tucked between parents or siblings. Their breath rose in faint mist over the pelts of deer, fox, or bison laid over them in layered protection. Beneath, evergreen branches woven into bed mats insulated their bodies from the frozen ground. Still cold despite hours of firelight, the air held the heavy scent of tanned hides, smoke, and the faint earthy fragrance of dried sage leaves placed near the fire for purification. Beside the sleeping furs, winter tools waited where they had been set the night before. Bows newly strung with sinew fibres hung beside freshly sharpened arrows tipped with flint or obsidian, their feathers bound tightly by glue made from boiled hoof scrapings. Snowshoes leaned against the lodge walls. Willow frames laced with rawhide dried by the fire to keep them strong. Tightly woven baskets stood near the entrance, filled with dried roots, cornmeal, smoked fish, and slivers of cured venison, ready to be carried out once the day began. Further from the warmth, the world remained frozen in a breathless stillness. The trees bordering the encampment stood as dark shapes against the pale sky, their limbs heavy with ice. The river, partially sealed beneath thick layers of ice, whispered faintly below, its hidden current winding like a memory beneath frozen silence. Nearby wooden stakes marked fishing entrances cut into the ice days earlier, now crusted with new frost. Small animal tracks dotted the snow around the village, faint prints of rabbits, delicate trails from small birds hopping along the ground in search of seeds. Farther out, the deeper marks of elk and deer led toward the shelter of pine forests and rocky slopes, Hunters would soon follow those trails, carrying spears tipped with stone blades and bows fashioned from ash or yew wood, relying on skill learned through winters past. Behind one of the larger lodges, stands of drying hides swayed gently where wind touched them. Buffalo skins, scraped clean and stretched across wooden frames, had stiffened overnight, their edges brittle with frost. Some were smoked earlier to soften and darken, destined for clothing or lodge wools. Others waited to be cut into winter moccasins, warm robes, or coverings for cradles. Bone scrapers with antler handles lay nearby, dusted in fine white crystals of ice where breath had settled and frozen. As the horizon shifted toward faint gold, the night watcher returned from the ridge, leaving a solitary trail of footprints through the packed snow. The fur around their shoulders shimmered with frost where breath had clung and frozen. They walked silently past the edge of the camp, the spear in hand lowered now that the darkest hours had passed. Snow crunched softly beneath their steps, a steady rhythm that marked the passing from night to morning. The sky brightened, slowly as if resisting the certainty of dawn. Colours deepened from grey to pale blue, touched by streaks of muted pink and copper. Frost along the teepee coverings caught the first glints of light, sparkling in silence like small stars returning to earth. Shadows softened, and the outlines of every lodge, pole, and drift of snow became clearer. Smoke rose thicker now as morning fires grew, spreading warmth into the heart of each shelter. The cold air near the ground still bit sharply, but higher up, the warmth curled around sleeping figures, gently waking muscles stiff from the long night. Outside, the first birds stirred in branches, shaking loose tiny avalanches of frost as their wings trembled against the morning chill. There was no rush to movement, only steady preparation. Coals were fed, hides adjusted, water warmed in clay bowls near the fire. The world outside might still be frozen, but inside each lodge, life coiled quietly, ready to unfold like a sprout beneath snow. And as the first light of sun finally brushed the tops of distant hills, the village remained steadfast, a circle of endurance beneath the winter sky. Its people shaped by frost, fire, and the quiet strength of generations that knew how to survive the cold without fear. The first light of morning touched the land softly, spreading across the horizon in muted gold and pale rose hues. The snow, untouched in the night except by watchful footsteps and wandering animals, shimmered faintly beneath the sun's earliest rays. Frost clung to every branch, to every lodge covering, to every piece of wood and leather left outdoors, turning the world into a silent sculpture of glimmering white. Within the lodges, the embers had grown into soft flames, casting gentle light across sleeping forms and winter tools. The air closest to the fire was warm and faintly fragrant with smoke, while the edges of the shelters still held the chill of night. Condensation formed where warm breath met cold hide, leaving behind thin lines of moisture that quickly froze into tiny ice crystals when the fire shifted and the air stirred. Bit by bit, movement returned to the village, not with haste or noise, but through quiet rituals born from countless winters. Elders, already awake, placed thick logs onto the fire's glowing heart, coaxing sparks upward until flames regained strength. Their hands moved with certainty, each motion purposeful, shaped by memory and the knowledge that warmth must be carried into morning before cold found a place to settle. Layers of fur blankets shifted as bodies stirred. Children remained bundled, their eyelashes tipped with frost, their cheeks warm against soft pelts. Older members of the family rose from their bedding of evergreen boughs and woven mats, stretching limbs that had grown still from hours of sleep. They moved toward the fire, letting the heat loosen their muscles and awaken numb fingers curled beneath winter skins. The interior of each teepee glowed quietly in the morning light that filtered through the smoke flap. Leather walls, stained dark from seasons of smoke, were stitched tightly with sinew to the wooden poles that rose in a perfect cone overhead. Beams of pale sunlight touched the edges of hanging tools, bows resting in hide slings, pouches filled with flint shards, and carved wooden spoons smoothed by time and use. Near the fire pit, drying racks held strips of meat cured days earlier, thin pieces of buffalo or deer seasoned with salt and smoke. Clay pots, their surfaces darkened by fire, rested half filled with melting snow set to warm for drinking and cooking. A stone mortar and pestle sat nearby, dusted with traces of ground corn and dried berries from the last meal prepared before sleep. Outside, the village took shape beneath the rising light. Smoke trailed higher into the sky, breaking apart in the soft wind that stirred atop the snow-covered plain. The snow itself was not untouched. Paths pressed by footsteps the previous day remained faintly visible, though softened by the night's snowfall. Snowbanks leaned gently against the lower edges of each lodge, sealing warmth inside and muffling sound from outside. The forest that bordered the camp began to shift with morning life. Birds, rousing from their sheltered perches, sent out brief calls that echoed lightly between snow-laden branches. A lone raven circled above the village, its dark shape stark against the lightening sky. Beneath the trees, a fox padded silently through the snow, nose low as it followed the traces of small prey hidden beneath the icy surface. By the riverbank, the world was encased in ice and shadow. Frost stretched across smooth stones and willow roots, while thin sheets of ice hugged the edges of the current. Beneath the frozen shell, water still moved in slow, dark currents, its quiet motion a steady pulse beneath winter's grip. Wooden buckets, lined with hide, stood where they had been left beside the water hole cut days earlier. Around them, frost had crept, forming tiny ridges along the edges. Back at the village, preparations began without words. Hands gathered dried wood from piles stored beneath a hide-covered awning. Sinew cords, stiff from the cold, were warmed briefly by the fires before being used to repair bowstrings and snowshoe bindings. Flint blades were inspected for chips. Dull edges were sharpened on smooth stones. Leather thongs were softened in warm water to be used in binding spearheads or stitching moccasins. The morning was not hurried. It was deliberate, carried out with the calm that came from knowing winter was not a storm to outrun, but a season to walk beside. Every task belonged to a cycle: fire, food, warmth, repair, each done in its own time, none forgotten, none done in haste. As the sun cleared the distant hills, it spilled golden light across the village. The snow brightened, no longer blue with moonlight, but white with the promise of day. Steam rose from the smoke flaps as fires grew stronger within. The frost on the teepee coverings began to melt in small droplets that traced silver paths downward. What had been a landscape of stillness slowly became one of quiet motion. And so the village greeted the morning not with noise or celebration, but with steady breath, renewed warmth, and the calm strength of people who had learned to live in rhythm with the land. Winter remained, vast and unyielding, but within the circle of smoke and snow, life continued, shaped by fire, by frost, by memory, and by the enduring will to persist. The deep heart of winter settles across the land, pressing its weight into every hollow of the forest and every crease of the earth. The tribe moves carefully through these long nights, not in haste, but in deliberate rhythm, born from generations of endurance. When the world outside lies buried in snow and ice, survival continues, quietly, patiently, within the sheltering walls of their winter homes. This is the season not of fields or hunts, but of hands moving in firelight, shaping what the coming seasons will depend on. The fires burn low but steady, their glow casting amber light over furs, tools, and wooden frames. Within the warmth of the lodge, each person has a task that threads into the fabric of survival. Animal hides, gathered before the frost arrived, are thawed beside the fire and stretched tightly across bending frames of willow or ash. Skilled hands scrape away what remains from the inner layers, using sharpened bone tools smoothed by countless hours of use. The scraping sound is soft but constant, a reminder that warmth in the cold months is not only provided by fire, but also by work done in silence. Nearby, sinew, taken from the backs and legs of animals, is carefully separated into fine strands. It is soaked, stretched, and wound into strong threads that will later secure arrowheads, bind handles, or stitch winter garments. Bone needles, carved from the leg bones of deer or elk, lie neatly arranged in small woven baskets. Each is finely polished, drilled carefully at one end to form a narrow eye through which the sinew passes. These needles glide through tanned leather and soft animal hide, forming seams that keep out the wind and snow more surely than any woven cloth could. The making of clothing continues through the night. Thick hide leggings, lined with rabbit fur or fox pelt, are reinforced at the knees. Moccasins are shaped to match the curve of the foot, with extra layers added to the soles for insulation against the frozen ground. Parkas and cloaks are crafted from elk, buffalo, or caribou, their fur turned inward for warmth, while the outer skin faces the storm. Every stitch is made with care, because in the cold moons of winter, a poorly sewn seam can mean frostbite, weakness, or death. Beyond clothing, the night is a workshop of deeper preparation. Hunters sit in quiet concentration, arrow shafts laid before them. They smooth each wooden shaft with sandstone or rough hide, making it perfectly straight. Feather fletchings, taken from turkey, hawk, or goose, are split and bound to the ends of arrows with thin sinew. Each feather must be angled just right, ensuring the arrow will fly true through wind or stillness. Beside them, small piles of flint, obsidian, or chert glint softly in the light. Stones are struck against antler hammers, shaping sharp arrowheads. Small flakes scatter like frozen tears, and soon the stones become pointed, serrated blades, strong enough to pierce the hide of deer or bison. The making of spears and lances continues in the background. Long, straight branches gathered months earlier are dried and stored in the rafters. They are brought down into the warmth, where the ends are shaped to hold stone or bone spear points. The bindings are tightened with heated pine pitch, mixed with powdered charcoal to form an adhesive that resists moisture and time. Spears, once complete, are stored upright near the lodge walls, waiting for the snows to melt and herds to return. In another quiet corner, snowshoes are being woven. A sturdy frame of bent ash wood forms the outline, while strips of rawhide are threaded in crisscross patterns, creating a lattice strong enough to carry a person over deep snow without sinking. The rawhide is tightened and stretched, then left near the smoke hole to dry. These snowshoes will allow the hunters to move swiftly across frozen lakes, through forests heavy with drifts, and over plains where game may still be found. Beside the snowshoe maker, someone shapes new tools from stone and bone, scrapers with smooth handles, awls for piercing leather, chisels for carving wood, and spoons from bison horn are crafted with precision. Each tool must fit the hand perfectly, for in the cold months, fingers stiffen easily, and a poorly balanced tool is more burden than help. The evening sees baskets being woven from willow, cattail, or bark strips. These baskets will store dried berries, nuts, roots, and smoked meat. Some are coated with pitch to carry water or broth. The rhythm of weaving is steady, calming, over, under, pull, tight. It keeps the mind focused and the hearth's warmth close. Another task belongs to those who work with bone and antler. They carve fish hooks, needles, arrow points, combs, and decorative pendants that carry symbols of strength, migration, or the changing stars. These small objects do not simply serve purpose. They remind each person of what they endure this season for, and what awaits when the snows recede. Outside, the winter storm continues, but within the lodges, life remains steady. The fire is fed with careful measures of wood and dried bark. Animal fat melts slowly in clay containers, becoming tallow for lamps or preserved for future meals. Smoke drifts upward, escaping through the opening in the roof, carrying with it the scent of cedar, pine, and slow-cooked meat. Before sleep, water is melted from snow over the coals and poured into carved wooden bowls. Dried herbs are added, mint, spruce needles, wild ginger, to soothe breath and warm the body from within. No words are spoken, yet the meaning is clear. Survival is not only the work of hunters and warriors, but of quiet hands, careful preparation, and the patience to build strength even while the world lies frozen. By the time the fire has burned low, the tools are set aside, and the lodge settles into silence. Outside, the stars burn cold and bright against the night sky, but within these walls, survival has already taken root in every stitch, every carved arrow, every softened hide. And so, winter continues, not as a time of stillness, but as a season of hidden work, where life is crafted one quiet breath at a time. The cold still held the land in its unmoving grasp, yet the people of the village could feel a quiet shift in the air. Not warmth, not yet, but something more subtle. The winds blew with a dryness that hinted at change. The snowdrifts no longer sank with every step, instead hardening into crusts under the morning sun. It was during these still winter days, when the world seemed caught between darkness and waiting, that preparations for the great hunt began. The hunters did not rush. Survival was a careful ceremony of steps that could not be broken or ignored. They rose before the light touched the sky, not with sudden movement, but with the slow deliberation that came from years of instinct. Within the quiet of their shelters, they examined their tools. Bows, once so reliable, were tested to see if the wood had warped from the cold. The sinew strings, stretched taut, were checked for fraying. Where needed, they were replaced. Fresh strips of deer sinew, soaked and rolled smooth between careful fingers, before being bound to the bough's curve and left to dry near faint embers. Arrows lay spread across fir mats. Their shafts were straightened by passing them above quiet flames, turning slowly so the heat would guide the wood into true alignment. Feather fletchings from owl, turkey, or crow were bound to the shafts with thin sinew and tree resin. Arrowheads of stone, carved from flint or obsidian, were sharpened against flat grinding stones, thinned until their edges were so fine they could split hide or bone. Each arrow was a thought, a prayer of precision, shaped not only by hands but by memory. Memory of hunts before, of hunger endured, of life preserved. Beyond the shelter walls, preparations expanded across the village. Women and elders tanned remaining hides, softening them with animal fat and smoke, so the hunters would have strong clothing that could resist frost and wind. Fur-lined leggings were sewn with bone needles, sinew thread pulled tight but never breaking. Mittens were thickened with wolf fur to preserve warmth in motionless hours during the hunt. Moccasins were repaired and reinforced, their soles replaced with new rawhide to bear the friction of snow and stone. Inside another shelter, rawhide was stretched across wooden frames to dry into shields or snowshoes. Snowshoes were vital, wooden frames bent into wide ovals, crisscrossed with rawhide woven tight. When finished, they spread a hunter's weight across the snow, allowing silent travel across frozen plains. Beside them, sleighs made of slender poles and hide coverings were prepared to haul back meat and bone should the hunt succeed. Food for the hunter's journey was gathered and dried. Strips of smoked venison and ground corn cakes mixed with dried berries were wrapped tightly in leather pouches. Water was collected from ice melted over fires and stored in animal bladders to prevent freezing while traveling. Small pouches of dried herbs for wounds, fever, or pain were packed carefully with stone knives, scrapers, and awls. As the hunters worked, scouts walked the edge of the village and beyond. They studied the snow for the faint marks of deer hooves or elk prints. Where willow branches bent under weight, they checked to see whether animals had passed, stripping bark for food. They watched the sky for birds that circled high. Ravens and hawks were silent messengers that revealed movement far below. They knelt by frozen streams to read the cracks in ice, learning which water sources might later draw herds. In sacred quiet, the hunters tended to their own bodies like tools. Fatigue was a danger sharper than hunger, so they slept in intervals, keeping muscles steady and spirits clear. They practiced drawing their bows slow and steady, even as the cold bit at their fingers. They walked the perimeter of the camp to strengthen their legs, stepping through deep snow, listening to how their weight shifted across ice and wind-packed drifts. Farther within the camp, elders performed silent, solemn routines. They gathered cedar, sage, and sweetgrass, binding them into braids for the ceremonial fires that would be lit before departure. No words were spoken, only smoke rising in thin spirals to the ceiling of the lodge, carrying thoughts to those who came before. Hunters touched the earth, feeling its frozen strength, remembering that they did not hunt for sport, but for life, to carry their people through the last stretch of winter. The night before their departure, the wind died almost completely. Stars sharpened in the sky like shards of ice. The fires burned low but steady inside each home. The village grew still, not from fear, but from anticipation. Tools rested in bundles by shelter doors. Snowshoes leaned against wooden poles. Weapons, food, and furs were tied into tight packs, waiting to be lifted. Sleep did not come easily, but it came silently. The hunters lay beneath layered hides and furs, eyes open to the faint red glow of embers. They listened to the shifting of wood, the pop of trapped frost thawing in the fire. Outside, the world lay frozen and vast. Somewhere in that white distance, animals moved, elk, deer, bison, unaware that the footsteps of hunters would soon follow. In the morning, before the sun brushed the horizon, breath would hang in the air like pale mist. The world would still be cold, silent and unchanged, but their preparations were complete. Every task finished, every tool sharpened, every stitch strong against the wind. And so, without words, winter watched as they prepared, quiet, patient, and unbroken. The village remained behind, quiet beneath layers of snow and frost, as the hunters stepped into the vast wilderness. Each footfall pressed into hardened snow, leaving trails that were soon softened by drifting flakes. The air was sharp and cold, biting at exposed skin, slipping beneath the edges of fur-lined clothing. Yet no hesitation marked their movement. Years of winter had taught them the rhythm of survival, the delicate balance between patience and action. The forest opened slowly before them, dark shapes of pine and fir stretching skyward. Snow weighed heavily on the branches, bending them toward the frozen earth. Occasionally, a branch would crack under its burden, startling a bird or sending a small cascade of white snow to the ground. The hunters moved carefully, listening to each sound, reading the subtle signs that the land offered. Footprints of deer, the broken branches of elk, faint tracks of wolves, all whispered secrets of movement and life beneath the frozen stillness. Alongside their physical preparations, every hunter carried knowledge. They understood the snow's texture, soft and powdery, where game might wander freely, crusted and hard, where movement would be slow. They followed animal paths, reading the angle of tracks and the spacing of hooves, imagining the journey of the herd before them. Each step was calculated, every pause a quiet examination of the frozen world. The hunters carried tools as extensions of their bodies, bows curved in their hands, sinew taut, flint-tipped arrows bundled carefully. Spears and knives hung from belts, sharpened to precise points, ready for sudden action. Small packs of food and tallowed water swung at their sides, alongside bundles of dried herbs for warmth and endurance. Snowshoes protected them across drifting fields, allowing silent passage without sinking into the cold crust that might alert animals to their presence. The wind spoke in low whispers through the trees, carrying distant sounds. The cracking of ice along a riverbank, the flutter of a bird startled from its perch, the distant rumble of heavy elk moving through sheltered valleys. The hunters read each signal, adjusting their path, timing each step to the rhythm of nature. Their eyes scanned constantly, noticing subtle changes in terrain, depressions hidden beneath snow, frozen rivulets that would prove treacherous underfoot, the glint of ice-coated rocks where misstep could bring injury. For hours, they moved as one with the land, each individual attuned to the other, their movements synchronized without a word. The forest thickened, trees forming shadows that stretched across the white floor like frozen pillars. In these moments, time seemed to slow. Breath rose in pale clouds, mingling with the faint smoke of distant fires from the village they had left behind. Every sound, the crunch of snow underfoot, the snap of a twig, the flutter of wings, was amplified in the cold, reminding them of the fragile balance of life and death in the wilderness. Occasionally, the hunters paused to examine traces of prey. The tracks were faint, partially obscured by drifting snow, yet each left an impression in their minds. They traced paths across hills and frozen streams, noting where deer had grazed, where elk had sheltered. They adjusted routes, planning the approach carefully. Each movement was deliberate, conserving energy for the chase, while ensuring the element of surprise remained intact. In small clearings, they checked their tools and equipment. Arrows were tested for balance, bowstrings retightened, flint points were held to the light, edges inspected for chips. Spears were sharpened against stone slabs, ensuring that the next strike would be effective. Every object was an extension of survival, and neglect could cost both life and sustenance. As the day wore on, the light began to wane, filtered through heavy clouds that promised more snow. The hunters sought shelter briefly in natural hollows or beneath dense evergreens, conserving warmth and observing the land in silence. Ice glistened on every branch and surface, reflecting faint glimmers of light that guided their steps. Streams, partially frozen, whispered beneath brittle ice, marking routes toward potential prey and reminding them of the dangers hidden beneath frozen surfaces. Evening approached, and the forest grew darker, shadows deepening between trunks. The hunters remained vigilant, not resting fully, for the hunt demanded constant awareness. Signs of life became harder to detect, and patience became their greatest ally. The wind carried scents that guided them, and the rhythm of snow beneath their feet maintained a quiet measure of focus and endurance. Through hours of motion and stillness, the hunters pressed deeper into the wilderness. Each movement, each pause, each adjustment was part of a larger harmony, a balance between themselves and the land, the rhythm of survival dictated by observation, skill, and the silent lessons of winter. They were both part of the forest, and apart from it, moving through a frozen world that was alive with unseen creatures, each step a negotiation with nature itself. And as night fell, bringing deeper shadows and colder air, the hunters remained in motion, steady, patient, and alert. For in the frozen wilderness, survival required every ounce of skill, every careful observation, every quiet breath. The hunters moved with the quiet precision of shadows, each footfall measured against the rhythm of the snow. The wind was a low murmur, bending the pines and carrying faint scents of distant game. Elk and deer had left tracks days before, paths traced across frozen plains and through sheltered valleys, each mark telling a story of movement, grazing, and vigilance. The hunters read the trails with unwavering focus, memorizing curves, distances, and breaks in the snow that hinted at where animals had paused or sought shelter. The sun, low on the horizon, cast long, fractured shadows across the icy landscape, making each depression and ridge of snow visible. The hunters slowed their pace, lowering themselves to move almost on hands and knees where the snow was light and loose. Snowshoes muffled their steps, spreading their weight over fragile drifts, allowing them to glide silently over frozen fields. Every crunch, every slight slip was noted, a subtle lesson in balance and patience. They paused frequently, crouched beneath dense evergreens or behind snow-laden ridges. Eyes scanned the forest floor, catching glimpses of movement in the distance. A flicker of tail, a subtle rise of breath against the cold, the shimmer of antlers through branches. Each sighting was catalogued in silence. No words were spoken, only the soft hum of awareness that threaded through their senses. Even the cold was red, its bite telling them which direction the wind carried, how the scent of human presence might reach the prey before their approach. When the herd was spotted, the hunters adjusted their approach. They spread out strategically, blending into shadows, using dips in the snow and natural cover to mask their presence. Bows were drawn slowly, sinew taut, arrows resting lightly on feathered fletching. Each hunter became a stillness within stillness, breathing measured and quiet, every muscle coiled and ready for the precise moment. Time itself seemed to stretch. Minutes lengthened into hours as the hunters moved with the land, reading it as an extension of their own senses. Snowflakes drifted gently, dusting their clothing and blending them further into the surroundings. The distant sound of snapping branches and low winter calls of animals created a rhythm, punctuated by the silent exhalations of breath rising in mist. Patience was as vital as skill. A single misstep could scatter the herd and end the effort for days. When the moment arrived, it was swift and decisive. Arrows flew silently, slicing through the crisp air. Spears were cast with measured force, following the calculated paths of a hunt that had been choreographed by observation, experience, and instinct. The movements were precise, the actions deliberate, and in each strike was the culmination of hours of preparation and years of learned technique. The cold air carried the faint echoes of the hunt, but the forest absorbed them quickly, returning to its frozen stillness. Once the prey fell, the hunters moved carefully, approaching with reverence. Every step was deliberate. The work of taking life was not rushed. The animals were studied, ensuring the kill had been clean, and each would serve not just for meat, but for fur, sinew, bone, and fat. Nothing was wasted. Each carcass would be carried back to the village or prepared on the spot for preservation, ensuring sustenance for families and warmth for the long winter nights to come. The hunt extended into the fading light, the day dissolving into twilight. Snow shimmered like crushed crystal as the hunters worked quickly and silently to collect, dress, and secure their prey. Tools were used with precision, flint knives to skin, bone awls to prepare sinew, wooden frames to support heavy loads, and rawhide bindings to carry meat across miles of snow. Even in exhaustion, every motion retained care, shaped by knowledge passed through generations. As darkness approached, the hunters paused at high ridges to survey the land, noting paths for the return journey. The forest was a quiet companion, shadows deep and dense, yet full of hidden life. Tracks of smaller animals intersected with their path, and distant calls of night predators reminded them that survival was never solitary, that the wilderness was alive in its own rhythms, indifferent yet instructive. The return to the village would be long, but the hunt's purpose had been fulfilled. The hunters carried not only meat, but the quiet triumph of survival, the work of preparation, the knowledge of the land, the understanding of weather, snow, wind, and the silent language of tracks. Each step back was measured, conserving energy and protecting the bounty until warmth could be restored by fire and shelter. Night fell completely as they approached home. Smoke from lodge fires welcomed them, and the village remained undisturbed, unaware yet of the hunter's precise success. The hunt was complete, the skill tested, and the balance of life maintained, a quiet harmony woven between human endurance, animal sacrifice, and the frozen wilderness that sustained them all. The forest, once the stage of pursuit and patience, now shifted quietly beneath the weight of the hunter's return. Each step pressed into packed snow, the soft crunch mingling with the low whistle of wind through pine branches. Packs of meat, heavy and carefully bundled, swung against their backs, balanced to prevent tipping and minimize fatigue. Spears, arrows, and knives rested within reach, tools still sharpened, still prepared for the unlikely encounter with predators on the journey home. The hunters moved deliberately, mindful of each step across frozen streams and icy slopes. Snowshoes carried them over drifts that might otherwise have hidden dangers, thin ice, concealed rocks, or patches of uneven ground. The cold bit sharply at fingers and cheeks, but the burden of the hunt lent focus. Every moment was guided by the knowledge that the village waited with warmth, fire, and the preparation that would transform this raw bounty into sustenance for families. Along the route, the hunters observed the subtle signs of the land. Tracks of wolves ran parallel but distant, following the faint scent of their quarry. Birds flitted nervously overhead, alert to movement in the snow. Yet the hunters pressed on, moving as one, silent, measured, each breathing in rhythm with the others. Their eyes scanned for the smallest shifts, a break in the snow, a glint of frozen water, a fallen branch marking the safest path. As they approached the village, smoke rose steadily from the teepees, curling into the pale sky. The warmth of the lodges promised respite, but there was still work to be done. Before the fires, the hunters laid down their loads carefully, ensuring each bundle of meat, each pelt, remained intact and uncontaminated by snow or dirt. The first step of survival had been the hunt. The second step was preservation. Inside the lodges, fires burned brighter now, tended by those who had stayed behind. Clay pots warmed, stones were heated, and smoke curled around drying racks, softening hides and preparing them for long-term storage. The hunters moved in practiced silence, handing over fresh cuts of meat and hides, their presence almost ceremonial. Every motion was precise. Strips of venison were hung on frames, placed near low flames to dry slowly. Thick hides were stretched across wooden racks, rubbed with tallow, and pressed into submission against the cold. Bone tools and sinew collected during the hunt were sorted and stored. Sharp flakes of flint became arrowheads or small knives. Antlers were carved into handles, scrapers, and needles. Rawhide strips were woven into bindings for future weapons or snowshoes. No part of the animal was wasted. Each element had a purpose, from fur for warmth to marrow for nutrition. The village itself seemed to respond to the bounty. Fires glowed brighter, casting shadows that danced across lodge walls. The scent of smoked meat and burning pine mingled, warming the air and signaling both nourishment and safety. Children slept quietly beneath firs, unaware of the hunter's return, while elders moved between lodges, overseeing the work with measured steps. The rhythm of winter survival continued seamlessly. Hunt, return, process, store, a cycle as old as the land itself. Evening fell, but the work did not cease. Meat was salted or dried to last through months of cold. Thick pelts were tanned and softened for clothing, blankets, and footwear. Small cuts of sinew and tendon were stored for repairs, bows, or arrows. Clay containers held melted snow, herbs, and fat, ready for cooking or preservation. The village had been sustained by preparation, and the hunter's success now ensured that this careful balance would continue. By nightfall, the village was quiet again, though alive with invisible work. The fires dwindled to embers, casting long shadows that flickered across furs and tools. Every item in the lodges reflected the effort of the day, the meticulous care of hunters, the skill of those who processed the bounty, and the unspoken agreement between people and land that survival was a shared responsibility. Outside, the winter night stretched endlessly, stars scattered across a frozen sky. Inside, warmth, food, and security held firm. The bounty of the hunt was transformed into life, meat to nourish, hides to protect, tools to endure. Survival, patient and deliberate, persisted through every careful step, every quiet motion, every moment of focused attention. And as the village finally settled, the fires glowing low, the frozen wilderness beyond the lodges remained untouched, waiting for the next season, the next challenge, the next cycle of preparation, endurance, and life. The hunters had returned, but the work was only beginning. The bounty of the frozen wilderness now demanded attention in the quiet light of the lodges. Each piece of meat, each pelt, each bone carried the weight of life and the responsibility to endure the harsh months ahead. The villagers moved with deliberate precision, hands steady and eyes keen, performing tasks that ensured the survival of families, the preservation of warmth, and the continuation of life through winter. The first priority was meat. Strips of venison and elk, carefully cut in the field, were hung on racks of bent willow. Fires beneath them burned gently, providing smoke to preserve the flesh without cooking it. The smoke curled slowly, infused with cedar and pine, scenting the air and keeping the meat safe from scavengers. Thicker cuts were salted and wrapped in layers of hide to dry, ensuring sustenance for weeks to come. Each strip was handled with care, tested for thickness, and secured so it would not touch the snow or fall to the ground, for waste was not tolerated in this season of scarcity. Hides were stretched on wooden frames, rubbed with tallow, and brushed with the warmth of the fire. Fur was combed and cleaned, ensuring softness and insulation. Every seam, every edge was carefully attended to, creating blankets, clothing, and coverings strong enough to resist the bitter winds outside. Leather was softened and cut to precise shapes for leggings, mittens, and moccasins, ready to be stitched with sinew into garments that would carry hunters and children safely through the frozen months. Bones, too, were meticulously prepared. Large bones were split and hollowed for carrying water or storing food. Smaller bones became tools, awls for piercing leather, scrapers for hides, and needles for sewing. Antlers were carved into handles for knives, spearheads, and decorative objects that also served practical purposes. Each cut, each polish, each sharpened edge was shaped with patience, for a single misstep could render a tool useless when it was needed most. The village itself, was alive with quiet labor. Some gathered wood for fires, splitting logs with stone axes that had been carefully maintained. Others repaired shelters, reinforcing the framework of tipis with additional poles and tightening coverings that had been loosened by wind or snow. Smoke holes were cleared to ensure proper ventilation, and snow was swept away from entrances to maintain warmth. Each task was simple yet essential, and performed with unspoken coordination that reflected generations of knowledge. Sinew and cordage were sorted and stored, ready for future bindings of tools, bows, and snowshoes. Bundles of dried herbs were placed near hearths, their scents rising gently in the smoke-filled air, prepared for use in cooking or for tending minor injuries. Small piles of flint and obsidian were set aside for shaping into arrowheads, knives, or scrapers. Every object, every material was placed with intention, ensuring that no resource was overlooked or wasted. Throughout the day, the rhythm of labor persisted. Hands worked steadily, guided by experience and necessity. The fire was tended continually, its warmth a constant companion against the chill seeping through the lodge walls. Outside, the winter sun cast pale light across the snow, reflecting in the icicles that hung from branches and lodges alike. The forest beyond remained silent, yet full of life, a reminder that the bounty came not from magic, but from observation, patience, and skill. As evening fell, the work began to slow. Meat hung dry, hides stretched and softened, bones and antlers carved and stored. Tools were sharpened once more and set aside. The village settled into quiet anticipation, knowing that each measure taken now would sustain them through nights that remained long and cold. The labor of the day was a silent celebration of life preserved, of lessons applied, of survival crafted in every motion. By the time the fires burned low, embers glowing faintly against the dark, the lodges were filled with warmth, the scent of smoke, dried meat, and tanned hides. Every surface bore the marks of care, every bundle a testament to preparation, and every tool a promise of endurance. Outside, the frozen wilderness held its watchful stillness, vast and indifferent, yet the village thrived within, a quiet harmony of effort, skill, and survival that would carry them through the rest of winter. As the days lengthened and the sun climbed higher in the sky, the land fully awakened from its long winter slumber. Rivers flowed freely, carrying life along their banks. Forests whispered with the soft rustle of leaves, now tender and green, and animals moved openly, guided by instinct and memory. In this renewed world, the village thrived, shaped by the labor, observation, and endurance of those who had weathered the harsh months. The hunts, the preparation, the crafting, and the careful stewardship of every resource had culminated in a delicate balance, one that would sustain life through seasons yet to come. Within the lodges, warmth radiated from fires that had been tended without pause. The aroma of smoked and dried meat mingled with softened hides and the earthy scent of fresh herbs. Tools and weapons, sharpened and stored, rested as extensions of the knowledge and skill of generations. Every object carried history, every action reflected wisdom. The sinews of bows stretched taut, not just for survival, but as a testament to the patient, deliberate work of human hands attuned to the land. The village itself was more than a collection of dwellings. It was a living organism, sustained by careful preparation, cooperation, and deep understanding of the cycles of nature. the people moved through their days with quiet rhythm. Children learned through observation, imitating the motions of elders as they prepared fish, repaired tools, or wove shoots into cordage. Each task was a lesson in survival, a bridge between generations, ensuring that the knowledge of hunting paths, of safe routes through forests and frozen plains, and of the crafting of tools would endure. Even play became education, teaching balance, patience, and the subtle awareness required to thrive in harmony with the land. As spring advanced, the villagers' relationship with the wilderness deepened. The rivers that had carried fish and water now reflected sunlight across open meadows. Fields once buried beneath snow revealed roots and shoots, berries and tubers, each carefully harvested. Birds returned, calling across treetops and marshes, signaling the continued cycles of life. Each step, each observation, each careful collection was an acknowledgement of the interdependence between humans and the natural world. Survival was not conquest, but collaboration. The hunter relied on the animal, the gatherer on the plant, and both on the knowledge and foresight of those who came before. The lessons of winter, the hunt, and the slow thaw of spring became woven into memory and story. Even as the immediate labour subsided, the village carried forward the imprint of endurance, the patience to wait for the right moment, the care to preserve and protect resources, and the understanding that life was sustained through rhythm, observation, and respect. The land, though vast and indifferent, was not without guidance. It taught attention to subtle signals, a change in wind, a shadow in snow, the sound of water beneath ice. These were lessons written not in words, but in lived experience, passed silently from elder to child, hunter to apprentice, across generations. The village, now settled in the cycle of renewal, exemplified the quiet harmony that defined existence in these lands. Every tool crafted, every hide tanned, every arrow prepared was a manifestation of survival through knowledge, patience, and devotion. The hunt had ended not in mere acquisition, but in understanding, an unbroken chain of preparation, observation, and skill. Life had been maintained, and with it, the wisdom of centuries was safeguarded. And as night fell over the thawing forests and flowing rivers, the village rested. Fires glowed softly, casting long, flickering shadows that danced across furs and tools. The wind, gentle now, whispered through the branches, carrying the scent of earth and water, of growing plants and returning animals. Above, stars glimmered in an endless sky, unchanged yet ever watchful, a silent witness to the continuity of life below. In that quiet, the story of survival, of preparation, and of coexistence with nature was complete. Yet it also remained eternal, a rhythm without beginning or end, as enduring as the land itself. The narrative of the first Native Americans, of their endurance through frozen winters and preparation for spring, becomes more than a tale of survival. It is a reflection on patience, foresight, and the careful weaving of human life into the cycles of nature. It is a lesson in respect, a testament to skill, and a tribute to the quiet, steady persistence that allowed a people to live in harmony with the wilderness, to thrive, to endure, and to carry forward the legacy of knowledge and wisdom into every season that followed. Through the meticulous preparation of each hunt, the careful crafting of each tool, the reverent observation of every natural sign, and the thoughtful transmission of knowledge across generations, life persisted. The cycle continued, unbroken, in a rhythm both practical and sacred, guided by the silent understanding that every act, however small, was part of a greater whole. The land and its people moved together in harmony, a delicate balance of survival and respect, endurance and wisdom, observation and action. In the end, the story is not simply one of winter, or of hunting, or of survival. It is a story of connection. Connection to the land, to its creatures, to its seasons, and to one another. It is the story of first steps upon frozen soil, of quiet preparation, of patience through snow and cold, and of the renewal that follows, ever waiting, ever present. And in that connection, life was not only sustained, but celebrated, honoured, and preserved. A legacy as enduring as the rivers, forests, and mountains themselves.